Good evening, fantasy football fans. Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Slant, brought to you by ProFootballFocus.com and powered by DraftKings. Michael, another week, another dollar. That's exciting times in the NFL, especially for Panthers fans, but I'm not going to be talking about that this week because our season is over. What we will be talking about today, actually, is some of these rookie wide receivers. I know we talk about them every week, but every week they get more and more impressive. So Mike Evans may be featured among some other guys, so we'll get there in a little bit. Following that, we'll also talk about some of the injury beneficiaries. There were several guys that got knocked out this week that could be out. I mean, at this point, Michael, we're talking about the fantasy playoffs in 2 weeks, so these guys could be coming into the mix over the fantasy playoffs, maybe making a big deal for your rosters. We're going to talk about all of those guys, but first, we want to talk about a couple of these guys that had really big carry totals, Michael. I'm not sure if this stood out to you the way it did to me, but just flipping around a little bit on Sunday, there were just tons of guys that were having 25, 30, even 35 carries this week, and it's just something that we don't really see anymore. We used to see it a lot more back in the 90s and the early 2000s, and when I want to ask you about these guys one by one and say, is this just a one-week situation, or is this something that's a little bit more meaningful going forward? So, Michael, let's start with the most recent game first, and I'll remind everyone that we're recording this just before the Monday night game kicks off. So the most recent game for us is the Sunday night game that featured Jonas Gray just running wild, 38 carries, Michael. This is great, especially because last week you just went on a great rant about how the Patriots' backs were so frustrating. Are you still frustrated by this?
Yeah, if anything, more so.
Okay, I thought you might be.
Yes and no. Look, I did see something where essentially, Belichick did the same thing last year to the Colts where he just ran it into the ground. So should it be
right?
Yeah.
Didn't LeGarrette Blount have 4 touchdowns in that game too? I think so.
Yeah, so it shouldn't be all that surprising, I think, especially those that really pay attention to the finer points. But does this by any means mean Jonas Gray is going to be getting 40 carries a game, or even 30 carries a game, or even 20 carries a game, and in any game the rest of the season? I can't believe that. Can you? You can't.
I mean, I wouldn't bet on it necessarily, but it's so hard to know with this team that. Like, imagine a situation where they played the Colts again next week. Like, what would you do then? Do you think this is specific to the Colts?
I'm
a little bit. Go ahead.
I would spend all of my fab money on Jonas Gray and not look back.
Okay, but yeah, I'm going to be curious to look at this for my weekly column. I do that a little bit, looking at fronts and how defenses play against certain teams, and I'm curious if maybe the Colts were just deciding to let that happen to them while they were trying to stop Tom Brady. And obviously it didn't work out here, but yeah, 38 carries, my gosh.
Well, and I think more importantly, Scott, the thing that I've really, learned, I guess, or just accepted is, I mean, that offense lives and dies by Gronkowski and how they use him. So I think it's probably fair to say the Colts, they, at all costs, they just said, you know what, Gronk's not going to beat us. Well, who knew that Jonas Gray was a worthy substitute? So, if anything, I think this just shows that to never count out the Patriots as long as Brady and Belichick are there, and that Belichick is the greatest fantasy troller of all time.
If you had to pick one or the other, would you rather have Jonas Gray or Shane Vereen the rest of the season?
Oh, God. Jesus. Oh, God.
By the way, I'm the second biggest fantasy troll behind Bill Belichick, just in case you were wondering.
You know what? I would personally, screw it. I'd probably go Gray, only because look, we saw what happened last year with Blunt down the stretch, and they just rode him. So, look, I would probably go Gray, but I wouldn't feel good about it at all, and I would just feel very, very dirty about it.
I mentioned a little bit last week how up and down Vereen had been this year, but I'm not sure this ever quite came up. If you had to guess off the top of your head, where do you think Vereen ranks among running backs for the season in standard scoring?
Ooh, I'm going to say in the 40s.
He's 21st.
Oh, okay.
Completely blew my mind. I mean, it's kind of what you expected going into the year, but I just feel like he's been invisible for so much of the year. But I guess if you add 300 receiving yards over a little bit more than half the season, that's just a huge impact for a running back.
Right.
Okay, next guy up. I thought that Jonas Gray had a lot of carries with 38, but apparently it wasn't that weird because Alfred Blue of the Texans had 37 carries. And this was
And
a little bit.
might
Go
I add,
ahead.
Scott, he had 11 through the first quarter.
Oh my gosh.
Got
So
it.
this is, I mean, maybe not predictable to the 37 carry extent, but we knew going into the game that Arian Foster was out. He was a Sunday morning scratch, but with enough time to know. And hopefully at this point of the year, and if you're not, you really need to correct this if possible. You need to own Alfred Blue if you're an Arian Foster owner. It doesn't really matter what size league it is. Um, but for all of these carries, Blue wasn't actually that tremendous in this game. How good do you feel about Blue if you have to plug and play him for Foster over say the next 4 games if Foster happens to miss another one?
Personally, I think they gave him the ball a lot because look, let's not forget it was Ryan Mallett's first start in the NFL too, and I think they probably wanted to mitigate some of that by handing the ball off and just quite honestly taking it out of Mallett's hands as much as they could. So, for me, it was obviously a volume day for Blue. To me, he hasn't proven anything that he's anything above replacement level, to borrow a baseball term. So. I'm not sold yet. Are you?
Not specifically. I feel like people are going to assume that this is a plug-and-play type of offense because we've seen other backs be successful for the Texans in the past, but I kind of feel like Arian Foster is one of the least appreciated stars of our generation. And you can see that in their efficiency this season, where Foster has 2.99 yards after contact per attempt, third best among all qualified running backs. And Blue has 2.16 yards after contact per attempt, 33rd of 51 qualifiers. That doesn't make Blue bad, and I'm glad to see that he can hold up under this heavy workload because the Texans do obviously run the ball a lot, but Foster is just a lot better than Blue is,
Well,
just plain and simple.
and let's also not forget, which I was surprised about this because I actually plugged and played this guy. Jonathan Grimes had 13 carries of his own for 54 yards. So, yeah, it was a big day on the ground for the Texans yesterday.
Yeah, I would laugh that off as something that's not important when you have 50 carries. Of course, your backup has to get 10 or 12 carries or whatever it is. But earlier in the year, I can't remember if this was week 2 or week 3, but the Bengals just ran all over somebody, and Giovanni Bernard had 30-something carries. Really surprising for that guy, but in that game, we saw Jeremy Hill get 15 touches too. And I don't know if that has anything necessarily to do with his recent run of success, but it did sort of establish him as the clear backup and demonstrated that he could take a full workload. And maybe that's what this means for Blue. I mean, I think I would rank Blue as a top 10 running back in any matchup that Foster's out. Do you feel the same way?
I probably would, just quite honestly, because of the team he's on. If they're going to be, if this is going to be the proportion of carries between their first and second running backs, and Blue's the starter, yeah, I'm probably okay with that.
Okay. Here's the third guy, and I think this is maybe the one that's the most interesting out of all 5 of the guys that I'm going to talk about here. Trey Mason of the Rams, 29 carries in this game. And Mason's not a very big player. I think he's maybe 210, but probably a little bit less. Runs hard, obviously. But not just the 29 carries in this game, 14 or more carries in 4 of his last 5 games. Are you sold on Mason as a top 15 back the rest of this season?
I am, only for the simple fact that, and as we've learned before, Jeff Fisher, he loves to run his running backs into the ground. So once a guy sort of has established himself as the starter, I think, in any Jeff Fisher offense, he doesn't let it go. And for the rest of the season, yeah, look, for Zach Stacy is obviously not the guy there. He has gotten, I think, 1 or fewer touches the last couple games. And look, Mason's running well. And look, yesterday the Rams got out to a lead early against Denver, who a lot of teams predicted would win the Super Bowl this year. And I think they probably thought, holy crap, we have a lead. We need to sit on it. So they just decided to pound the ball after that. And it's not a bad strategy to go. I mean, Mason performed fairly efficiently. So, yeah, I would go with Mason as a top 15 guy purely for the volume I think he's going to get the rest of the way.
Even 2 games ago, I think we were a little bit worried that this wasn't a job that Mason had, just the clear job. You saw Benny Cunningham getting some work, some passing down work as well. I think we're beyond that, so I agree. I feel safe about Mason too. this is obviously really beneficial to his dynasty stock as well, where he probably also is a top 15 running back. Wouldn't you say?
I would. My only my only concern would be this is where we were with Zach Stacy last year, where we thought, oh, a rookie drafted late and he's getting all the carries. Surely he's destined for dynasty greatness. So now that's not to say Mason's not better than Stacy. I think he probably is, but again, I'm not all the way there with Mason as a dynasty option yet, but I'm definitely there on a redraft basis.
I guess we'll just have to pay close attention to what the Rams do in the draft this season.
Right,
Because
right.
we all left Mason off as a backup type of player,
Right.
and we're wrong. So, all right, next up, we actually mentioned this guy a little bit ago, but Jeremy Hill, he had another start for Giovanni Bernard, who missed, I think, his third straight week here. I'm not sure if that's true, but I think that's true.
I think it's second, but yeah, it's been a couple weeks, yeah.
It feels like forever, gotta say. Jeremy Hill gets 27 carries in this game, and he's been a very clear top 10 back in Bernard's absence. It's almost better in fantasy when Bernard misses because Hill just gets such a huge amount of work with Bernard out. And while Bernard has performed like a top 10 running back with Hill there's still a bit more of a workload split. Bernard, I guess he'll come back this week. We'll have to see. But when he comes back, how do you sort of suss out this backfield? Does Bernard go back to being the 70 to 30 type split guy with the passing down work that makes him a top 10 back, or has this just gotten a lot more complicated?
To me, it's gotten a lot more complicated, and I say that as a Gio Bernard owner in several dynasty leagues, and it really concerns me, quite honestly, because Hill has run very, very well. And look, it's not as if he hindered the team yesterday. They won. I mean, they scored 27 points. So. Yeah, I don't know. I'm up in the air on what they're going to do going forward. It's kind of a pick your poison type of deal. It seems like where, look, they could go a lot of passing plays with Bernard out of the backfield, or just pound it with Hill. I don't know what I mean for you. What do they do the rest of the way? Is it an even split, or do they go more passing stuff, or do they pound it with Hill? I mean, it worked yesterday, but that's not to say it's going to work every time.
I have a clear opinion about this, but I want to ask you first. Do you think there's any risk? Do you think there's any risk that Bernard has lost the job or lost the lead back role?
I do. I'll say I do not, but I'm not 100% on that, which is the coward's way out. But that's what I'll say.
That's fair. So I am more firmly in the camp that Bernard is fine and is going to be back where he was before. I still expect Hill to get a substantial amount of work, so 40% of the carries, but I think with Bernard, he's effective enough as a running back, and he's such a dynamic pass catcher that he'll be fine. He's always the type of player that makes more sense with maybe 200 carries a season as opposed to 300,
Sure.
especially with the passing down work. And Hill's recent success, it's recent in our minds. We assume that he's just been amazing, but over the course of the season, they've been pretty similar as runners. Bernard, 2.67 yards after contact per attempt. Hill, 2.65. So very similar there, but Bernard adds the versatility, and I think Bernard is also a very good pass blocker as well. So I don't think Bernard has endangered himself here at all, and I think this is probably a pretty good time to try to acquire him if you haven't passed your trade deadline in your league. Maybe your league doesn't have one. He's a player that I would feel pretty good about down the stretch run and through the fantasy playoffs this season. And I'm maybe the only one that still feels that way, but that's how I feel about it.
Well, and I think, look, let's face it, which running back is a better complement to Andy Dalton in that offense? Is it going to be Bernard or Hill? I don't think there's any doubt it's probably Bernard, especially, with as many passes as Bernard was getting out of the backfield. He was getting quite a bit. So, yeah, I'm with you there. I'm still a Bernard believer, we'll say.
Okay, and here's the fifth guy. I kind of cheated a little bit here, to tell you the truth. I'm throwing Mark Ingram on this list, who only had 23 carries, but Ingram had 7 receptions in this game, which blew my mind. He had just 35 catches in his 3.5 seasons as a player entering the game, so I was like, well, okay, that was kind of crazy. But Ingram has had a ton of work, mostly carries, in recent weeks, especially as both Kyrie Robinson and Pierre Thomas have been out. So, I mean, there probably doesn't need to be a lot of analysis here. I mean, Ingram's just a clear top 10 back, but what do you make of the 7 receptions? Is that just a weird situation here? Does it have something to do with the fact that the Saints were just getting destroyed by the Bengals, as you mentioned, or could there be maybe some more pass work coming up for Ingram, which could potentially make him a top 5 running back?
I don't know. I think it was just a function of the injuries they were dealing with. I think they work a lot more efficiently if they've got a clear-cut guy running the ball and a clear-cut guy catching the ball. And look, like you said, Kyrie Robinson, Pierre Thomas have been out for a couple weeks now for both of them, and I think even Travaris Cadet was was in the mix there for a little bit. But I don't know. I'm not a believer in Ingram being a pass catching back quite yet. I think it was an anomaly, and I don't know, man. Just overall on the Saints, I don't know what's going on there. I mean, are you concerned with them at all, just overall? I'm a little bit.
Do you mean in terms of fantasy value, or?
Well, yeah, fantasy and just in real life. I mean, they scored 10 points yesterday.
Yeah, they're bad. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. I mean, it definitely hurts Drew Brees, who's hurt even more by Brandon Cook's injury.
Right.
Did he break? What did he break? A finger?
He broke his finger, yeah.
So he may be out through the fantasy playoffs too. Probably will be. So it could be pretty tough to ride with Brees as more than say a low-end quarterback one the rest of the way. But honestly, that might just be more fuel for Ingram to be successful. And you mentioned that this is unusual for Ingram to have 7 catches. That was on 7 targets. He had 5 targets in Week 10. So I feel like, I mean, the reason this is happening is probably because Pierre Thomas is out and Kyrie Robinson too. But okay, they are, and I think Ingram can benefit. He's been great. So
sure. Well,
I feel really good about him the rest of the way.
Well, and let's not forget, even though the Saints maybe aren't running as efficiently as they used to, Drew Brees still had 41 attempts, of which Travaris Cadet still had 5 targets and 4 catches for 31 yards. So, look, you may be onto something. There may be room for a pass-catching back like Cadet to go along with Ingram, and they still get, to each their own. So, I don't know. I don't know. I just think there's a lot of things in flux there as far as which mouth is getting fed in that offense, but.
Yeah, we may have to circle back to that a little bit later. But first, let's head on to our second segment here, and it's all about the rookie wide receiver love. This is unbelievable how great these rookie wide receivers have been. This week it was all about Mike Evans, who caught 209 yards worth of passes. I think he's had 7 receptions the last 3 games, and that actually has moved him up to the number 9 wide receiver on the season. So Evans is behind only Antonio Brown, Jordy Nelson, Demaryius Thomas, Jeremy Maclin, Emmanuel Sanders, Randall Cobb, and Des Bryant in standard scoring. How crazy is that, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So thoughts, like, is Evans a top 10 wide receiver for you now, or is he a top 20 wide receiver for you now? I mean,
wow.
It's not like the Buccaneers have been lighting the world on fire, although they did just handle the Redskins pretty effectively.
Right. There's no doubt he's a top 20, and look, I'll even admit this. Even yesterday when I was going through my daily fantasy lineups, Evans was valued pretty highly, and to me I thought he was too high for what I thought he could do, but I was obviously very wrong on that assessment. So look, he's a physical mismatch, seemingly for every quarterback they put on him so far. And it's not like he's slowing down any. I mean, I think it's fairly fair to say that a guy like Kelvin Benjamin, who started out really hot, kind of got into a funk a little bit. Now he's getting garbage time production, but look, even a guy like Evans, who they're targeting, is still getting his share of catches and yards. So look, if he's not a top 10 option at this point in redraft leagues, he is like on the cusp for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Evans, his actual numbers, I'll read those out because I'm going to do some more specific comparisons here. 46 catches, so not a huge catch total, but 794 yards and 7 touchdowns. Both of those are very nice. Let's compare them to some other players that are in their range in terms of overall yearly scoring. Would you prefer Evans or Golden Tate, who basically did nothing for the first time this year in a game where Matthew Stafford was just awful, so it's not like Calvin Johnson did much either? Evans or Tate?
I'd probably go Evans at that point.
I would too. Okay, here's a different one. 2 kinds of, I'll say styles, but I'm not even sure that's true. But Evans or Julio Jones? Jones has 34 more targets this year, but 4 fewer touchdowns.
To me, look, I still love Julio. I still think he's one of the top receivers. And look, the targets prove it. He's not. It's not for lack of trying. I think in that offense, I'd still go Julio in that scenario.
Me too, but I'm not feeling good about it. Okay, Mike Evans or my boyfriend DeAndre Hopkins, whose numbers are eerily similar. 46 catches as well, same as Evans. 764 yards, so 30 fewer yards, but only 4 touchdowns. So that's 3 fewer than Mike Evans. Evans or DeAndre Hopkins?
You know, I would probably go Evans. I'm trying to look up what Hopkins did yesterday
I think he
specifically.
had four catches for 80 yards, if memory serves.
Okay, yeah, 4 for 80, no touchdowns. Okay. Um, Man, I'd probably go Evans at that point. Yeah, I'd probably go Evans. I think Hopkins is probably more. Well, I'm not even going to say Hopkins is more consistent. I don't even know if that's true anymore with Evans. I mean, it seems like Evans is good for for 4 for 120 and a touchdown every week. So, to me, I would probably go Evans, but it would be pretty close.
I'll still lean Hopkins, but I agree that it's close. You're right about the consistency thing. Over the course of the season, Hopkins hasn't really had any dud performances. It's like his bad games are 4 to 5 catches and 60 to 80 yards. So
Right.
that's very usable, and that's really great for a fantasy playoff stretch if you're in sort of those head-to-head matchups. But Evans, too, even before his recent barrage, I feel like he had maybe 3 or 4 games in a row with 50 catches.
Yeah.
This has just sort of been a ratcheting up of his performance all year, and it probably just peaked, but I feel really good about him going forward, too.
Yeah.
Taking a little bit of a step down, but somebody else who's performed really well lately, Jordan Matthews. I feel like before the season we talked about him quite a bit as one of the potential perform now guys, and then I think he got lost a little bit in the shuffle because Jeremy Maclin started out so hot. But Matthews has come on really strong. He's up to 44 catches, 562 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So again, the catch total and the yardage total, not exactly amazing, but for a rookie, they're great. And 6 touchdowns, that's tremendous. So what do you think of Matthews?
Well, you know what the narrative is, hey, him and Sanchez have pretty good rapport because they worked on the second team this year a lot in preseason and training camp and stuff like that. I think Matthews is just pretty good, quite honestly. Now, I'd like to see what's going to happen from a dynasty perspective on who the quarterback's going to be, but for redraft, like yesterday, Matthews had 5 for 107 and a touchdown. Macklin still had 9 for 93 and a touchdown. So it's not like either one of them. It's not like their production is mutually exclusive, you know. So, I'm a believer in Matthews, and look, I think overall he's a better option than anyone else on that team, save for Macklin at this point. So, yeah, no, I'm a believer in Matthews. I mean, I'd still take Evans over Matthews, but I think
Obviously.
yeah, I think Matthews is a definite top 20 option the rest of the way, though.
Top 20, wow.
I would say that.
Let's put that to the test and pick out some more specific guys here. I shot him a little bit lower, but maybe you'll have to bring me back up a little bit. But would you prefer Matthews or Mike Wallace the rest of the way?
Ooh, you know, I would probably go Matthews. Quite honestly, I think Matthews is getting into a groove now, and I just think it's a better offense to be a part of. And I don't know that there's that much difference between those two guys as players in a vacuum. So I would take the better offense that the player's in, and to me right now, that's going to be Philadelphia, hands down.
Interesting. Okay, Matthews or fellow rookie Sammy Watkins. Matthews has 1 fewer catch this year, 90 fewer yards, and 1 more touchdown than Watkins. Although Watkins, obviously, he's been limited a little bit in recent weeks by what I think is a groin injury.
Ooh.
Maybe hamstring. Everybody's hurt.
You're going to make me – this is going to be a hot take, Scott. Okay, so just get – I would probably go Matthews the rest of the way, quite honestly.
Is that all about Watkins' injury?
No, it's not all about it. It's some concern. I think the quarterback play, as much as it's going to be just extremely odd to say this, is probably a little more reliable from a fantasy standpoint in Philadelphia than it is in Buffalo right now. I mean, there's already chatter about another quarterback change in Buffalo now, and we're not even 6 weeks into the Kyle Orton era there. So I would
Who's left on their bench? I don't even know.
I don't know. Who knows? I mean, did the trade deadline pass? Can they still trade for Jimmy Clausen, or is that ship sailed at this point?
I think the Bears need to keep him. That could be important.
That's another segment. But no, look, injury aside, I might go Matthews anyway, personally.
Interesting. All right, what about Matthews versus Steve Smith? 49 catches, 731 yards, and 4 touchdowns on the season, but not much lately.
Scott, how dare you? No, I'm going Matthews. Come on now.
You don't even think that's close? Are you serious?
It's not even close for me.
My gosh. Yeah, I'm clearly undershooting you here with Matthews, which means that I'm not nearly as high on Matthews as you are. But
Steve Smith? Scotty.
731 yards this year. What's wrong with that?
In like 3 games.
He's been better than you think. He just hasn't scored lately. The scoring is really the point here with the rookies because there are 20 wide receivers this year that have 5 or more touchdowns this season, and 6 of them are rookies. Kelvin Benjamin has 8, Evans 7, Matthew 6, and then Sammy Watkins, Allen Hurns, and John Brown all have 5. But there are only 3 rookie wide receivers in the top 30 wide receivers in targets. That's Benjamin with 94, Watkins with 81, and the tier Allen Robinson with 76, despite missing the last couple of games and the rest of this year. So a lot of these rookies are performing based on their touchdown performances, and that's something that we tend to say will regress towards the mean over time and is less reliable than the targets. So are you concerned at all about that? Or, I mean, in a lot of these cases, Benjamin and Evans specifically, their size is what makes them appealing in the red zone, so maybe you're not as concerned about them. What are your thoughts on the rookie receivers as a whole?
Yeah, no, I'm not concerned with the touchdown totals in the least, especially like you touched on with Benjamin and Evans. I mean, this is exactly why they were drafted, is to be a red zone target. Even, despite the fact that Mike Evans is catching, I think, touchdowns like at 50 yards at a time, but regardless of that, no, this is why these teams drafted those guys, was to be a big, tall presence, especially in the red zone. So. Look, I think it's probably happening a little earlier than a lot of people predicted. I don't know of a lot of people that would have predicted a 10-touchdown season from Kelvin Benjamin his rookie year, which is certainly what it's looking like it's going to be. But I think this is, what people had hoped would happen, and it's happening just a little earlier. So, no, I don't expect any regression to the mean, at least from those top-tier guys. I think from the mid-level guys, your John Browns, your Allen Robinsons, there might be a little bit of that there. Not that they won't be good, but no, for the stars of this rookie class, I think they're right where we all expected them to be. They are who we thought they were, Scott.
Thanks, Dennis. We briefly mentioned this too, but I want to point out for people that weren't maybe plugged into this, because the Jaguars were on bye last week, but with Allen Robinson out for the rest of the season, Allen Hurns is a pretty sneaky pickup, and he's probably on a lot of wires right now. Again, a guy that wasn't really considered much coming into the year, has had a couple of big games that may skew his total fantasy production, but could be a guy getting some work down the stretch. And speaking of that, let's move on to some of these injuries. There were a lot of guys that got hurt last week. We've already talked about a few, and maybe we'll swing back to some of those, but there's some other really big-name injuries here, Michael, and I want to get your thoughts on the players that could benefit from increased opportunities here, especially as the fantasy playoffs approach. Let's start it off with one of my longtime favorites, Ahmad Bradshaw. God, man, he needs some new legs because it's always his feet, his ankles. It's just every year. I feel terrible. He was having an unbelievable year for the Colts this season, but with the broken ankle, he will probably be out for the rest of the season. The obvious guy here to benefit is Trent Richardson, Michael, but Richardson's a guy that we've all loved to hate in recent seasons. Are you just going to plug your nose and go ahead and pick up and deploy Richardson as maybe a flex-worthy or maybe even a running back 2 candidate?
Oh. Let's be fair. Trent Richardson, I think, has not been as bad as certainly I thought he was going to be this season. I mean, not to say he's not been good, but he hasn't been as bad, I think, as some people thought he might be. Now, running back 2, I think maybe, but only because of volume, and he's the clear-cut starter there. I mean, it's really unfortunate, and this might be the latest in the season Bradshaw lasted of any of the last seasons. But I don't know, man. For me, it's more about the Indy passing game. I think this just gives them more reason to start chucking it, and you could see 50 pass attempts from Andrew Luck the rest of the way.
Well, we'll be getting there in a second, but I want to finish up with the running backs first. Richardson, this may be a bit of a surprise, but he was already seeing a really heavy workload. I know that Bradshaw's been the more effective fantasy player, but entering Week 11, Richardson was one of only 14 backs with 10 or more carries a game and 2.5 or more receptions per game. That's a bit of an arbitrary total there, but it was something that I was looking at last week. So Richardson has been getting the work, but hasn't been tremendously productive in a fantasy sense, except for when he falls into the end zone, which has been occasional. But I'm not sure how much this really improves his abilities here. The question might be, too, with the other running back on the roster, Dan Herron, who is not the pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers, I found out, but he was actually drafted in the 6th round of the 2012 draft by the Bengals. And here's about all I know about him. He was a pretty good player at Ohio State and actually was a little bit of a receiving threat there. Had 19 catches for 180 yards receiving in his biggest junior year. 5'10", 213 pounds, kind of a similar size to Ahmad Bradshaw, actually. Is Herron somebody that's going to get a little bit more work now that Bradshaw is out, maybe make him worthy of a pickup in standard maybe, or maybe deeper formats?
I think so. I really do. I think he could see some passing down duties. And look, anyone that is guaranteed snaps or targets in that offense, I think, is probably worth owning. So, and look, I think it's fair to say they're not going to suddenly convert Trent Richardson into a workhorse back with 30 carries a game, a la the guys we mentioned before. So, yeah, I think he's worthy of a pickup. I mean, look, it's a lottery ticket by all means. It's not a sure thing, but look, you're banking on that eventually the production will swing his way. So yeah, I would take a chance on that, I think.
I would too. It's a little tricky now that we're beyond a lot of the big bye weeks and maybe everybody's coming back at this point. But if you have the roster spots to work with, then I think Herron is worth picking up even in shallow formats. Because I tend to think that he may step a little bit more into Bradshaw's role than many would expect. I think Richardson will probably kind of maintain his workload, to tell you the truth. But one of my bigger questions here is about what Dwayne Allen's loss will mean for these backs. And Allen's one of the best run-blocking tight ends in the league, plus 5.5 run-block grade so far this season. Is the 6th best at the position, and he's been that good at run-blocking ever since he jumped into the league. But let's talk about Allen, too, from a pass-catching standpoint. He had a high ankle sprain, the reports say, that could lock him out again for the rest of the fantasy season. So Kobe Fleener benefited in a major way in the Sunday night game. He had 7 catches for 144 yards on 7 targets, so quite a bit impressive here. That brings Fleener up to the tight end 11 on the season, which may be a surprise to some. But then again, Dwayne Allen was the tight end 7 here for the season, so as much as these guys have been sort of alternating, they've both been fantasy relevant. And now that Allen's out, what do you think of Fleener? Is he like rocketing up as maybe a top 5 tight end the rest of the way?
I think so. I really do. And it's kind of, those rankings are indicative, I think, of the fact that you maybe have 1 or 2 elite options at tight end in fantasy, and then there's everyone else. I mean, right? I think that's fair to say. There's not a clear-cut number 3 at this point behind Gronk and Graham, is there?
Well, we'll get to Julius Thomas in a second, but throwing him out of the picture.
Okay, no. I will grant you that. So after those 3, I don't think there's a clear-cut 4 and 5 and beyond, right?
Well, there's a clear-cut 4/3, and it's Greg Olsen. But after that, I think it gets really questionable.
Yeah.
And I'll throw out some names here for you. Kobe Fleener or Martellus Bennett, who has just 1 touchdown since week 4 and is averaging only 4 catches a game since week 5.
Yeah, I would go Fleener in that matchup all day. I really would.
I think you have to. What about Fleener or Larry Donnell?
I go Fleener. I think Fleener's in the better offense, and look, especially now. I think that would be even close if Dwayne Allen weren't hurt. But now with Dwayne Allen hurt, yeah, I think to me that's a no-brainer.
What about Fleener or Travis Kelce?
Oh man, you know what? I go Fleener until Andy Reid proves otherwise, that he will in fact use Travis Kelce like most fantasy pundits say he should. I'm not going to believe it till I see it. So I would go Fleener the rest of the way, 10 times out of 10.
Kelsey's been pretty good, you have to say.
No,
But
no,
I think
it's not Kelsey's fault. It's a fact that he's not getting the targets and the receptions, I think, to warrant him being picked over a guy like Fleener, who is going to get his share of a lot of pass attempts.
Well, I agree with that point for sure, and I agree with you. I think Fleener actually is the tight end 5, or possibly the tight end 4, because here's what we know about Julius Thomas's injury. He injured his ankle. There's no. I think this one it appears after just a day's worth of news. It's a lot less severe than the Dwayne Allen high ankle sprain. He's more in the day-to-day range, but who knows? He could miss a week or could be ineffective a little bit going forward, which makes him a bit of a risk. And Thomas is one of actually multiple Broncos injuries that could really cause a lot of change in this offense. Emmanuel Sanders suffered a concussion, so it's unclear whether he'll be back for Week 12. Ronnie Hillman, news is that his foot injury is worse than we originally thought. He's out for the year. Monte Ball, Reed. So who does that leave on the Broncos that you're willing to start in fantasy? Obviously, there's Demaryius Thomas. Who else among the skill position players do you feel good about right now?
I would feel good about C.J. Anderson, I think, the rest of the way. I mean, he's he's sort of the last man standing in the Denver backfield. Well, I say that now, but watch Juwan Thompson start the last 4 games. Look, you've got Welker that could make a comeback down the stretch run. I mean, they're like you said, they're going to need bodies essentially. And look, it may be time to fire up another rookie receiver in Cody Latimer. Who knows? But yeah, you're right. They got a lot of injuries that they're dealing with, and that's gonna open things up. But I think, look, at the end of the day, Demaryius Thomas is just gonna see a ton of targets. We could have a 20-target game for Demaryius Thomas here real soon.
Is this a concern for you with respect to Peyton Manning?
No. Personally, no. I think Peyton has proven over the years he can turn stuff into gold at any day. Look, anyone that can turn Brandon Stokely into a 1,000-yard receiver out of the slot can work some magic. So no, that wouldn't affect. Look, will he be setting records like he did last year? No, but will he still? I think, is he good for about 3 touchdowns a game on average? Yeah, I think there's probably a pretty good chance of that still rolling on.
Okay, you mentioned C.J. Anderson here, and it's kind of sneaky, but he's been the number 5 back in fantasy for weeks 10 through 11, and obviously there were quite a few players that were on bye one of those 2 weeks, but Anderson has been very productive over that time. He only had 119 rushing yards in those 2 games, but 12 catches for 159 yards and a touchdown through the air, and that was great. If he can be that productive as a receiver, then I think he can pretty clearly be a top 10 or top 15 running back the rest of the way. Let's compare him to some of the guys, too, in that range. Would you rather have Anderson the rest of the season or Chris Ivory, the running back 15 so far this season?
I would probably, I'd probably go Anderson. I think there's a lot more opportunities to score, that's for sure. And even in standard leagues, if you're counting receiving yards, which Ivory has little to none, yeah, I'd take Anderson over that.
Okay, I may be going the wrong way then, but Anderson or Frank Gore, the 18th running back this season?
Ooh, hey, why would you do this to me, Scott? As much as it pains me, I'd probably say Anderson, quite honestly. Again, I think there's just a bigger chance to score. Like, for example, I picked up Gore in a Dynasty League yesterday, sort of at the wire, and while he's still, on his good days, he's going to have 80 yards on 20 carries like he did yesterday. He's just not scoring a lot. And frankly, that offense isn't scoring a lot. And I think there's just a better chance of C.J. Anderson getting a touchdown on a per-game basis than Frank Gore. So I would still take C.J. Anderson.
That's true, and Gore is kind of like Ivory in that he doesn't really do much as a receiver anymore. He did for the bulk of his career, but not this year, not the last couple of years. One more here, C.J. Anderson or Joique Bell, the 21st running back of the season?
I'd go Anderson, I think, at that point. I don't think there's much of a difference from running style or physical style from any of those running backs, so I think you have to look at the scheme and the team and just, the overall situation. And I think of all of those teams you mentioned, C.J. Anderson is in by far the best. So I would take him out of all 3 of those the rest of the way.
I would too, and I think that makes him maybe even a top 10 back the rest of the way. We'll just
Sure.
have to see whether there's anything else the Broncos can do with the position.
Yeah, I think any running back that is, not guaranteed, but I think is assured most of the work in such a high-powered offense such as that, I think is worth a look as an RB1, and he's definitely that.
Okay, I didn't write this one down, but we talked about it a little bit earlier, and it reminded me that I should have. But with Brandon Cooks' injury, is there anybody that you're thinking about in New Orleans that is somebody that can maybe benefit from that absence?
Yeah, Kenny Stills all day.
Yeah, he scored, I saw, again. He scored maybe 2 of the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, which again may be good or bad, meaning somebody could have picked him up by now, but I think they're going to need receiving options in New Orleans, and I think Stills is a perfect candidate, especially obviously for the deep ball that I think Cooks took some of that away from. So if anyone, I think Stills is probably the guy that stands to benefit the most. But as we touched on before, I think just overall, the offense is it's not like it's completely fallen off the map, but it's definitely not performing at the same level as it has the last couple of years. So, while I say Stills, I don't think that means he should step in right away and match the production that someone else might have in previous years. Does that make sense?
It does. So are either Stills or Marcus Colston in the top 40 at the position?
For me, I would probably take Colston in the top 40 just because, they're still going to pass a lot. I mean, Drew Brees still had 40 attempts yesterday, but beyond that, no. He would be, on the cusp, I think, of the top 40 for me at that point.
I think you're right on there. All right, Michael, I think that clears it up for another issue of the Fantasy Slant. Thanks for everybody for sticking with us this long. Check our other podcast by our other great hosts the rest of this week, and we will catch you next week.